presentation that Alan and I are going to make presents some research that we did last year that focuses on the way in which the Care Quality Commission inspects acute hospitals. And I think it's relevant to the professional regulatory sphere because those two regulatory domains are moving closer and closer together. There are sorts of changes in policy, not least the introduction of things like revalidation. What I'm going to do is say a little bit by way of background and set the scene and describe what we think the Care Quality Commission is trying to do in its acute hospital inspections. And then Alan is going to present some of the results, focusing particularly on some of our qualitative findings, and then I'll finish by picking up on some of the issues of impact after inspection and some conclusions. Very quickly, by way of background, the Care Quality Commission exists to regulate organisations in health and social care. It has had a very turbulent and difficult and challenging time since it was created as the third regulator we've had in this sphere since 1999, created in 2009. It had in 2012 and 2013 a complete change in its leadership and also a complete rethink of its strategy for regulating and its regulatory model. And it rolled out a new regulatory model which is tested first in acute care and is now starting to use in other health and social care sectors. It's a lovely diagram. I'm not responsible, of course, for a colour diagram. I can't do that, but this is a diagram that CQC uses trying to explain how its new model works. And I'll briefly try and describe it and then talk a bit about the ideas behind it. This replaces an approach to inspecting acute hospitals in which CQC would send a small team of 2 or 3 inspectors, generic regulators without particular content knowledge in acute care, who would undertake direct observation in a number of pilot areas over perhaps 2 days in an acute hospital and would base their report on that set of data. So in the new approach, they collate an encyclopedic data pack about the organisation, drawing together data from a very wide range of sources in advance of inspection. They send a large inspection team, typically of about 30 people for an acute trust on a single site, more for multi-site acute trusts, who contain a variety of people with clinical, managerial and other expertise in data analysis and in regulation. They inspect across 8 core clinical service areas. They undertake about 3 to 4 days of field work in each trust. So that's, if you think about it, in a typical DGH, about 90 to 100 days of inspection field work. They collect a mass of data, which they bring together and review and try to corroborate and triangulate. At the end of their inspection, they provide verbal feedback, and then a few weeks later, they produce a detailed narrative report and a set of ratings of performance on the performance scale you can see there on the right-hand side of the diagram. So what can we learn about what I would describe as high-intensity inspection from CQC's experience? That's, I think, the question. The ideas lying behind their new approach, I think they've concluded that these are really large, complex organisations with high levels of risk and organisations where it's quite difficult to get change to happen. So they need much greater scale and depth of data collection. They concluded that to understand these organisations, you need detailed content knowledge. You need to know about the variations in practice that can and cannot be explained. And you need credibility with these organisations, so they've moved to have these big, highly expert inspection teams. They've concluded that these organisations are heterogeneous, so they may perform well in one clinical area, much less well in others, and so they need this coverage of at least 8 large clinical service areas. They've concluded performance is multidimensional, so they don't just look at effectiveness, but they also look at safety, leadership, responsiveness and other domains. And they concluded that to help these organisations do something with their findings, they need more than a simple pass-fail. They need this very detailed narrative report, a set of ratings of performance, to give accountability, to create leverage and impetus for change, and to provide the diagnostic value not just to core performance, but also to organisations performing well. So some brief idea of some of the ideas lying behind this quite radical change in regulatory design and approach. So we did field work over about 6 months or so, interviewing people about the design of the new model and then observing a set of inspections, undertaking interviews with inspection team members and trust staff after inspections, and then undertaking some surveys of a couple of hundred inspectors and several hundred staff from trusts following their inspections. As I said, we're going to present primarily some of the quality findings. I'll hand over to Alan, and I'll come back to talk about some of the conclusions.
Okay, thanks Kieran. So the structure of how I'm going to report this is we're going to look through the stages of the inspection, and I'm going to make a few key points, but we're also going to display lots of quotes, so I hope I have time to read those while I'm just making the main points. So the first thing, so actually before the inspection takes place, what is the impact then? Well, I think we would say that there were small changes. So there were some substantive changes in a number of trusts, but generally small changes which were brought about because of this anticipation, oh, we're going to be inspected. And so, for example, there might be changes of emphasis in what is done, gave an opportunity for trusts to actually think, well, what are we doing here? What ought we to be doing? Should we be changing things? And it perhaps provided a lever so that, for example, areas which perhaps weren't performing well, individuals could be, it provided a lever for managers to say, look, we're being inspected, you need to do something about this. So there's a table showing a number of the things that were reported that trusts said that they did. And I think a key message here was that trusts were actually trying to provide what they felt was a true picture of what they were doing. But that meant that they had to brief staff, inform them about the inspection so that actually it wouldn't be something like a Hawthorne effect where everything was so different because people were worried about the inspectors being there, but would be able to show off the trust, show what they were really doing. So actually a lot of the preparation was about that, about preparing staff rather than making substantial changes. And why were they doing that? That was because actually there was quite a lot of credence in the model. Kieran outlined some of the principles underlying that, and trusts largely agreed with that. They felt it was right to have professionals, large teams, multidisciplinary teams, inspecting their organisations in order to get a good inspection that would find out what was going on, but that it would identify good practice, also would identify areas that needed improvement and so on. So based on that, trusts have decided that they wanted to try and provide a true picture of what was going on, and they would help with that. So that all sounds great, but there were and there are lots of challenges in order to achieve this in practice. So first of all, there's a logistical challenge. So gathering all that data, 90 inspection days worth of data, that's a vast logistical challenge, both for the trust to provide data, so inspection teams would be requesting information during the course of the inspection over 2 or 3 days and want that to be provided. That might take some time for the trust to find it, prove it to go out and so on. And then that might actually leave little time for the inspection team to deal with that information and to actually incorporate it in what they want to do, or there might be a gap because the information hadn't arrived. And the quantity and quality of the data, the diversity of it, was also a challenge for analysis. So although there are all these different rating areas, which I'll mention in a little while, there was also a need to bring data together across what might be a large service, for example. So medical and acute elderly wards in a large trust. How are you going to inspect maybe 30 wards over the course of 2 or 3 days? So there might be some sampling of wards, focusing on particular ones. How do you do that? And then when you perhaps find lots of variation within one of these service areas, how do you bring that together into an overall judgment or rating? So that was a challenge for the inspection teams. Also, in terms of the rating categories and what they called the nexus, so the aspects about effectiveness, safety, leadership and so on, they were quite a challenge, for the teams to understand. So what does it mean? What qualifies as safety, safe practice here? They had to try and understand those in the rating categories and then allocate information to those categories in order to summarise it and make a judgment. And that was really, really challenging for the teams because these were quite broad descriptions, so it's quite hard for them to actually put the information together and reach judgments. Also, timing or timeliness was a challenge. So the trust were engaged, they were eagerly anticipating the results from the inspection, and so there was an undertaking to give some early feedback at the end of each day of the inspection. But also, the inspectors were wary when giving that they hadn't had time to analyse all the data. What should they say? And there were instances later on when the report came back after quite a long period of analysis of the report together, that actually it didn't seem to match what people had been told in the immediate aftermath or during the inspection. So there's an issue there about providing feedback that people want and information in a timely way, but also in a way that provides the right feedback. Then, just to finish off my part of the presentation, then I think these other slides relate to the future engagement of organisations with this regime. And so it was felt to be a good idea. I've highlighted some challenges and how is that going to turn out. So providers were engaged, but can the inspectors respond to that and give them what they want and expect? So providers did read the reports, the draft very, very closely. There was quite a lot of contention about factual details, and in some cases about the ratings that were given. And the aggregation of ratings to higher levels, which CQC does. So the ratings are aggregated at the end of the total aggregation to give a single rating for the whole trust, which spans 8 service areas in as many as 4 hospitals, for example, encapsulating that in a single judgment. There have been some issues about the way that process has played out. So there's an example of the ratings for a single hospital there, about how those play out. And actually the aggregation algorithm that CQC uses to aggregate these is quite interesting. It gives more weight, in a way, to the extreme judgments on the scale. So, for example, if you look down the columns here to get the overall weighting, so if you say, look at the well-led column there, you have 2 inadequate judgments, 1 requires improvement judgment, and 4 goods. And the overall judgment is that it's inadequate. That's sort of counterintuitive for the people who are in the good service areas when they say, well, we're mostly good here, why have we come out as inadequate? So it may or may not be the right way to go, but it was certainly counterintuitive for many staff, and that there could be an issue there about the continued credibility of the ratings. And here's a table which shows agreement about ratings. So this is comparing the ratings provided by CQC with what trust staff said in a survey about what they felt the rating for their staff should be. So if you look down the diagonal, you can see that there's pretty good agreement about the good and outstanding levels, and perhaps you might expect that. But as you go down the scale, you know, actually, not many trusts like to be rated as inadequate. And it's difficult to tell from our data whether that's just an issue that they can't accept all services, or whether actually it's been difficult to identify when a service is inadequate.
I'll just finish quickly, I promise, Jerry, on the sort of impacts and follow-up to these highly intensive inspections. As we said, they receive a detailed narrative report, a set of ratings, and broadly speaking, in interviews, people said that they largely accepted the findings. They saw the they saw the findings as having generally face validity. They questioned aspects about process and method and some issues, but they also asked them what's going to happen as a consequence of this. With some data from our survey to suggest that actually 2 things happened, that in many places the inspections foregrounded, if you like, issues of improvement or change in the organisation and led to action being taken that perhaps might not have happened so quickly, and that in about half of the organisations, the inspections highlighted issues which weren't necessarily already on the organisation's agenda to act upon. But the action after inspection is a really kind of complicated and problematic area because, as this quote from a CQC interview says, it's not their role to drive improvement. They're not the improvement agency. But it's not clear whether that sits with other regulators, like monitoring TDA, or just with the organisation itself and its board. Perhaps they're the people who should be responsible for improvement. So very briefly in conclusion, I think there's no calculus by which we can work out value for money for these inspections. They're expensive, as you've heard, in terms of the time and effort, but these are very large organisations, employing thousands of people with hundreds of £1 million of spend a year on providing healthcare. In broad terms, this new model is seen very positively by most people as improvement from the model it replaced. Lots of things that might perhaps be changed or improved to refine it. But it's the creation of a narrative from inspection that describes performance and arrives at these ratings that's really difficult. One of the lessons is that the more you know, the more you need to know, the more data you collect, the more difficult it is to make sense of that set of data. But these are complex organisations and complex services. And I think for me it highlights the role of judgment in undertaking the inspection and the importance, therefore, of the credibility and authenticity and authority of those who are making the judgments, the people on the inspection teams. And the final point is that impact and follow-up is perhaps the area where all regulators and inspectors have to think about the consequence of their actions. In this case, pressure to inspect and to undertake the process perhaps leaves impact and follow-up as something of an orphan process.
So we move swiftly on to Gillian White from CQC.
Okay, so Kieran and Alex's statement was a very good introduction to what we're talking about. My name is Gillian Marsden and I work with the Care Quality Commission and work very closely with Kieran and Alan on the work they undertook last year. But what I'm here to talk to you about today is the work that we've been doing with Frontier Economics, and I'm here with my colleague Vicky Cedric from Frontier Economics to talk about the work that we've been doing to kind of answer where Kieran's presentation left off, really, to understand, well, what can we know about the costs and benefits of CQC's regulatory activity. So, why are we doing this? And I think that's kind of the context which I wanted to provide in the first slide. You think, whoops. Oh, okay, so let me just take you through, there we go, take you through the full slide. Sorry about that. So the reasons for this are twofold, really, why we're trying to answer this question. I think the first reason is that, as Kieran explained in his presentation, the CQC has, perhaps rightly, been under quite a lot of public and political scrutiny since its creation in 2009. And that's in large part due to high-profile failings in Staffordshire, in Winterbourne View, in Morecambe Bay, etc. And we have, as a result of that, had to really transform the way that we work and gone through a quite wide-ranging transformation of our regulatory approach, which Kieran can explain more about in the acute sector. But since we rolled out in the acute sector, we're progressively rolling out in the other sectors that we regulate. And we've got to, we've really had to, we really wanted to understand what the kind of impact of that is, and actually how well is that working, how is that impacting on providers, on public and stakeholders, what impact is that having in terms of costs. As Kieran alluded to, our new regulatory approach is much more expensive, and how does that play out when it comes to actually organisations making improvements, what's the cost of them of that, but also crucially, what is the benefit that CQC is having, and how can we perhaps isolate that. And so we need to do that to be accountable to our stakeholders, but also crucially for CQC, we've tried to embed a culture of learning and improvement so that we, as an organisation, try to learn and improve. So we've embedded a quite comprehensive evaluation programme as part of our transformation, and one part of that is to understand the costs and benefits. So I'm going to hand over to Vicky now to talk in a little bit more detail about the work that we've been doing with them. Thank you, Julian.
Okay, so I'll be talking about the work that we've been doing for the CQC, and as Julian just mentioned, CQC aims to be transparent in assessing the costs and benefits of its regulation. To do that, it needs a robust framework, and it's commissioned Frontier Economics to develop that framework with CQC. Just so you know who we are, we're an economic consultancy. We advise governments and businesses in making evidence-based policy, regulatory and strategy decisions. So I'll talk you through the framework that we've developed and how we've taken that to the data. So we've developed a series of logic models as the basis for understanding what CQC's impact is. And we have to break that down. So on the left-hand side, you can see that we're analysing CQC's main regulatory activities. So that covers registration of providers, locations, managers, monitoring risk levels across a range of different sectors, the biggest part of what CQC does, which is inspecting and rating based on those inspections, enforcement action where standards aren't being met, and also providing an independent voice in the sector on the quality of care. So the reason we break down by those different activities is because we expect them to all have slightly different impacts. We also break down our analysis across the main sectors that CQC regulates. You can see they're diverse. So we look at adult social care, both in residential and community settings, primary medical services, so that includes GPs and out of hours, primary care dental services, community health care, mental health services, and acute hospitals, both NHS and private. Again, we break those down because they're very different. You'd expect the costs and benefits of CQC's regulation to differ across those sectors. So, for example, it's more costly for CQC to go and inspect care that's provided in community setting in quite a dispersed way, rather than going to visit a care home where all the is in one place. And then at the impact end, you might also expect different impacts from CQC's various interventions. So, for example, in some sectors, CQC's ratings might be used by patients to choose who their provider is. In other sectors, that's less relevant because patients don't have that choice of provider that they can go to. So then, coming to the logic models, we've developed a logic model for each sector. What the logic model is a framework for understanding how CQC's regulation is expected to improve the quality of care. So from what CQC does, so inputs and activities, so that's CQC spending time and money on going and inspecting and doing other things. There are also inputs from providers themselves, so in facilitating inspections and also in making changes in response to CQC's regulation. Outputs are things like CQC's publications on the state of care or publishing ratings. And then intermediate outcomes that we think about are behaviour change as a result of what CQC is doing. So that might be a patient using a rating to decide where they go. It might also be a provider making changes as a result of CQC's recommendations. And then the final outcomes that we're really interested in is what's the result of that behaviour change. So does that mean that the quality of care is improving? How is it improving? In developing these, we've worked closely with CQC because CQC needs to own and use this framework in future to evidence the cost benefits of what it's doing. We've also engaged quite closely with some of CQC's external stakeholders and with academic experts. So we've been speaking with people from the Department of Health and also National Audit Office who are very interested in what the cost benefits are of CQC's new regulatory model. So, having developed a framework for understanding what CQC's impact is likely to be, the next step is taking that to the data and testing it empirically. So we've agreed that a difference in difference approach is what we'd ideally like to do or to use to isolate CQC's impact. And that uses panel data that varies both across providers and also over time. And what we look at is a number of different measures of quality, so that might be friends and family scores, so whether people who use services would recommend them to their friends and family. That might also be things that are specific to a certain service, like accident and emergency waiting times. So a range of different quality measures. The steps of this analysis are in 3 parts, and the charts show you those steps. They use dummy data, so they're not real quality metrics. The first step is looking at what the raw data says, that's the top right chart. So you can look at a quality measure over time, and the 3 different waves of, because CQC has been rolling out its new model in waves, so you can look at how quality is developed over time for providers that have been inspected at different points in slightly different approaches. The next stage, which is in the second chart, is to then normalise that data. So you're looking at before and after the intervention for each of the waves that you're looking at. And that might tell you about, say, how the impact of inspection differs depending on the wave of CQC's approach. And then the third chart, which is the difference and difference part, is comparing outcomes before and after an intervention for those that experienced the intervention versus those that didn't. And the idea is that we're interested in observing how a quality measure developed over time for a location that was inspected or experienced some kind of intervention versus the change over time for a similar location or provider that didn't have that intervention. In practice, the analysis that we've done so far isn't isolating an impact of CQC's inspections on end quality outcomes. That doesn't mean that CQC's regulation isn't having an impact. The approach is new, there's quite limited data to work with about this, so often the sample sizes that we're using are quite small. And then in some settings, we just don't have the type of metrics that we need on end quality outcomes to be able to do this type of analysis. So one avenue that we're looking at is whether we can use CQC's own ratings as a measure of quality for this type of analysis in future. And the other thing that we're doing is really focusing in on behaviour change, so the intermediate outcomes associated with CQC's regulation. So survey analysis allows us to understand what providers are doing differently as a result of CQC's regulation. On the left-hand side, you can see some examples of the types of surveys that are available in relation to inspection. So the post-inspection survey gives provider views after they've been inspected. The provider feedback survey gives similar responses, but they're anonymous. Frontline staff survey asks staff about their views on inspection. And then the inspection team survey also gives CQC staff's own views on how the inspection process is working out. That tells us about things like whether providers are making changes as a result of CQC's inspections, and to a more limited degree, what the specific changes are that are made, which we're really interested in. These surveys tell us some interesting things. So the chart on the right shows across different sectors how far providers agree that the inspection visit helped them reflect on how they could improve their services. You can see that the views are quite positive. So the red and the light blue bars are strong agreement or agreement. Generally, these are quite positive across sectors, slightly less positive amongst GPs and out of hours and also primary dental services. But what that isn't doing is saying exactly what the changes are that have been made and what their impact will be. So in future, case studies will help to fill those evidence gaps on what the end outcomes are, what the behaviour changes are, and also what's missing at the moment on the cost side is what it actually costs to providers to be regulated by CQC and also to respond to CQC's regulation. And to get a real full picture of value for money, we need to know about cost to providers as well as cost to CQC itself. So where does that leave us? We developed an approach and we've tested it with the data that's available so far using CQC's new regulatory model. There's a framework in place that CQC can now use on an ongoing basis. A spreadsheet model underlying all of our assessment and also a draft impact report that we've filled in as far as possible at the moment, and CQC can add to it in the future and indeed publish it to set out the current evidence on the costs and benefits of what CQC is doing. There's also a process for replicating and reporting that analysis, so kind of how to complete future impact reports. And as I mentioned, there are substantial evidence gaps, so a big part of what we've been doing is working out what the priorities are for filling evidence gaps and exactly how they can best be filled. So part of that is around improving existing surveys, so adding questions so we have more information on specific changes that are made as a result of CQC's regulation, and also around cost to providers and understanding what the burden is on providers of responding to CQC's regulation. I suppose the other point to make here is that our focus is really on establishing the impact of CQC. In a traditional cost and benefit analysis, you have monetised costs and monetised benefits, and you can compare them. In this setting, we're looking at monetised costs, obviously, but the benefits can't really be monetised in a lot of cases. So the focus is really on establishing CQC's impact, so that can then be compared on a non-monetised basis with CQC's and providers' costs. Thank you.
We'll move this swiftly on and into lunch.
Thank you. We're working at the opposite end of the scale from Kieran's high-intensity inspections, and really working with registered pharmacies and trying to understand the impact of those. This is a piece of work I've been doing in the past 6 months with the GPHC to really help prepare the organisation to evaluate its approach to inspecting and regulating registered pharmacies. And I want to take you through some of the process that we've gone through in developing some of the logic models to underpin that evaluation and some of the highs and lows that we've experienced along the way in doing that. Just by way of context, the GPHC is unusual among regulators here in that it has a dual responsibility to regulate both registered professionals, pharmacists and pharmacy technicians, and also registered premises. And that creates a really interesting thing when we come to think about how the regulation works, and the GPHC, I think, recognising that registered professionals have an enormous impact on the delivery of, the quality of the delivery of services, regardless of whether the premise that they're working in is regulated by the GPHC or by the CQC or not regulated. We're largely talking about registered pharmacies. There's some 14,000 of those that the GPHC regulates across Great Britain, Scotland, Wales and England, and largely in community services. So if you imagine your high street Boots, we're talking about that. That's what's being regulated. The GPHC introduced new outcomes-focused standards for registered pharmacies in September 2012, and that was a deliberate move away from what had been a very rules-based and prescriptive approach to regulating pharmacy practice. And one of the things that flowed out of that was a need, therefore, to have a different approach to inspection. A compliance-based tick box approach to inspection wasn't going to cut it when you have outcomes-focused standards. So a lot of work was done to think about the way in which inspection might be delivered differently. One of the other things which is happening for the GPHC is that there are changes in legislation coming, much needed changes in legislation, which will give the organisation the ability to publish its inspection reports. It can't currently do that, and also give it a fuller range of enforcement powers. And given that it's been in this prototype phase of inspection, the organisation has been committed to evaluating what it's been doing and learning from the best of that, so that when those new powers come on stream, actually it can move forward with a full model, which with some assurance about what it's doing. So why evaluate at all? Broadly, the GPHC comes at this from two angles. One is that it expects its policy development to consider outcomes for patients. That's a real challenge in regulation. I'll talk a bit about outcomes in a moment, actually to identify the relationship between what we do as regulators and the difference that that makes for patients. But the GPHC is focused that its policy making should attempt to do that. And the second is using evidence to improve pharmacy. They took a decision to underpin evaluation with a logic model, which is one of the pieces of work that I've been doing over the past 6 months. And that really is an attempt to understand the impact of different regulatory interventions ultimately on the outcomes for patients and users of pharmacy services. There are significant challenges and opportunities in developing a logic model, as any of you who've been involved in this will know. And really, we're trying to answer this question: what difference does regulation make? And there are some elements to what makes that challenging. First is that it can be very difficult to identify clear outcomes. If you're adopting a logic model approach to a program, say a health intervention that you're designing and starting, you have a baseline that you're starting from, you know what it is that you want to achieve, and then you can see whether you've done that. In the world of regulation, which is a moving feast, it's an ongoing process, for some professions now going for 150 years, actually understanding what difference it is that you're trying to achieve is significantly challenging. We also need to account for the enormous range of influences on potential outcomes. Within the context of pharmacy, not just as I mentioned, the professionalism of pharmacists and pharmacy technicians, but the business environment that they're working in, the corporate structure that they're part of, their NHS contract requirements and monitoring requirements, other regulators that they engage with, like the MHRA. And of course, the expectations and needs of patients and people using their services will affect the outcomes that they can achieve. And we also then have this final challenge, which is about making clear connections between interventions over here and outcomes over here. Reflecting on some of the work which Geoffrey Braithwaite has done about safety and complex and adaptive systems, we can imagine that these things are linear, and a logic model forces us into thinking in a linear way. Actually, we need to recognise that these things aren't linear. The influences are substantial, and simply pulling a lever over here doesn't necessarily mean that something comes out here. We're dealing with lots of relationships, not a sausage factory. But there are some good things that have come out of this process as well. It's been incredibly useful to surface assumptions and inconsistencies as the organisation has gone on, its position has changed. So actually, what we meant to do and what we're actually doing may not be in the same place. It can be an opportunity for reflection and learning, and it's also an opportunity to move beyond acting just from a point of principle. As regulators, we tend to do things because they seem like good things to do, but actually understanding what they might be doing as a result is an important thing. So we adapted a pretty standard logic model approach, much like the one that Vicky outlined, and really focused on some questions instead. So looked at what resources does the GPHC have, what does it do with those, what does the pharmacy do in response, what are the outcomes that are created within the pharmacy, and then what are the outcomes that are created for patients as a result. One of the things that we acknowledge is that this is a relational business, and that we move in that kind of way. So in building the model, it started with desk research, analysing GPHC policy and approach, observation of regulatory practice. As I say, some things have moved on. So what actually are we doing? I spent a lot of time asking, what do you actually do to people? And then we categorised what we found against some regulatory interventions, really to start to break down these things into manageable chunks. So looking at registration, looking at standard setting, risk assessment, inspection, action planning, enforcement, strategic relationship management, by which means GPHC's relationship with large multiples, and then reporting and publication. And as we've gone on, the logic model has been subject to review at different stages. And actually, from a Hartman point of view, that's moved, from my point of view, towards the right place. We started with the review, which was really about, are the actions that we've described, in terms of what's going on, the right ones? To thinking about, what outcomes are we seeing? Are there any outcomes we'd expect to see which are missing? And does that point to interventions that we might not have? And then moving on from there, how might we evidence these outcomes? I'm very careful to talk about evidence rather than measurement, particularly within the world of pharmacy, which is a very numbers-driven business. Actually, to think about qualitative evidence can be a valuable way of understanding whether outcomes for patients are being achieved. Just before I hand over to Robert, I just wanted to give you an insight into the complexity. So this is just one part of the logic model that we've designed. As I say, it comes in 8 parts. This is actually the most complex, which is about inspection, which in the context is the relationship that an inspector has on a day with a pharmacy coming to a point of judgment, and then there are other actions that flow as a result of that. One of the things which I've outlined again and again to people who've seen this is the importance of reading from left to right, to actually, that we don't over-ascribe the regulator's influence on the outcomes, and that we fully take into account the influences. This is a work in progress. We've got more work to do on unpacking the outcomes and the relationship between the outcomes. One of the other things that we're doing with this is using it to underpin evaluation, and I'll hand over to Robert, who will speak to you about that.
So we are starting to commission some evaluation into two aspects of the logic model. That is the inspection prototype, which Andy mentioned, and our outcome-focused standards, which obviously play into the inspection process. So the prototype inspections we've been running now for 15 months, and we have inspected 3,000 pharmacies in that period of time. That is out of a total number of 14,500. We have a rating system, like the CQC, but different descriptors. We have poor, good, poor, satisfactory, good, and excellent. So what we're about to do now is commission some research to evaluate and test the assumptions in the logic model. And as I say, we've inspected 3,000 of our 14,500 pharmacies, so we've got a comparator, so we can go out to pharmacies that have been inspected under the new model and those that haven't. We can make comparisons between them in terms of the outcomes that we're achieving. And we'll be looking at outcomes within the pharmacy rather than outcomes for patients. That's an important piece of work that will be done at a later stage, but at the moment we need to understand what outcomes our inspections are having within the pharmacies themselves. And so, as Andy said, this is a qualitative evaluation based on feedback from the pharmacies. So the initial focus of the evaluation is on 4 of 8 regulatory interventions. That's the standard setting, that's our outcome-based standards. Inspection, the action planning that follows on from inspections, and reports and publication of inspection reports. Now, at the moment, we don't publish our reports, we don't publish our ratings, because we haven't got the legal powers to do that at the moment, but we are taking those powers and we expect to have them by the end of the year. And our intention then is to publish reports and ratings. So examples of some of the questions that we want to try to get answered by this evaluation. Are the standards encouraging pharmacies to focus on patients and users of their services? So is it achieving results in terms of patients? How do pharmacies prepare for inspections? Is action planning effective in leading to sustained improvement? And do the reports that we then issue challenge pharmacies to actually improve quality and safety? And that's an important bit of our work, because it's not just about ensuring that risks are managed, but also that we can improve services within pharmacies as well. And that's especially important with the developing role of pharmacies within the community, and the fact that we want pharmacists to be doing more within the community setting. So the next steps is to appoint an agency to undertake evaluation from probably the middle of April. And we actually want this done relatively quickly, by around July as a completion date. Because this will underpin consultations that we wish to carry out later in the year on taking the prototype inspection model forward, and also our rating systems, which is under review at the present time. I mentioned the descriptors earlier, but we are reviewing those descriptors this year. And then when that's been done, we'll be looking at evaluating other of our interventions, including the professional regulation functions. Thank you very much.
We've just got time, I think, for perhaps 5 minutes of questions, so do the presenters want to come up and just ask questions? Shane? Yeah.
Thanks, Judge Shane Carmichael from the General Medical Council. Just first to say thanks for a really interesting set of presentations. One suggestion and one question. A suggestion, I mentioned this to Malta over at the CQC, that perhaps the most effective outcome from today is that we look to what colleagues in CERN are doing. We gather our resources, we build a regulatory version of the Large Hadron Collider. We demonstrate that regulation is the god particle in safe practice, and we ask Harry to play Brian Cox. Question is for Kieran and Alan. Where do you see the CQC inspection model moving in the context of the 5-year view, Labour's 10-year plan, Simon Stevens' vision for vertical horizontal integration and changes in Manchester? How will this scale up or not as we start to look truly at systems and not just organisations? And second part of the question is, where does professional regulation, or where should professional regulation be playing into that as we move to what we should surely be going towards, which is some sense of collective assurance, both for systems and for patients?
Do you want us to do that, or are you going to take several questions?
There's a couple of questions. Do you want to take
Yeah, happy to. I'll have a go. In other sectors, or in other countries where they have more integrated models of care delivery, I think you see models of regulation that still look at organisations, but also perhaps look at systems of care. It's really hard to predict where the 5-year forward view is really going to go, and to what degree indeed it will create new organisational forms. But I think you'll still see a need for organisations to be regulated. And the history, if you think of the history of sort of local government regulation and the work of the Audit Commission on local area agreements and trying to regulate a place, a whole geography run, it's harder and harder to do that. So the further you get away from the front line of service delivery, the more difficult it gets to make sense of the data that you have. I think, I said the acute hospitals that CQC is trying to inspect are huge, complicated organisations. The Barts inspection, which I had the joy of attending, 4 large acute hospitals, 80 people in the inspection team over 4 days, making sense of what you see, collecting that data and then arriving at a narrative and inspection judgment is very, very challenging. As you know, CQC is already using data from the GMC survey of trainees in its regulation to give it an insight into what trainees think about the care delivered in hospitals. And that, it seems to me that the two domains are moving closer and closer together. I talked to a Danish regulator at the IAMRA conference, and of course in Denmark they have a single organisation that regulates both organisations and professionals. And you could see the slight kind of look of incredulity on her face when she realised that not only do we do these things separately? But if, for example, there's a problem in an organisation, you might see quite separate investigations of that by CQC and by one or more than one professional regulator, interviewing the same people, collecting the same data, and then holding separate processes for investigation and adjudication. That's harder and harder, I think, to stack up. So perhaps, you know, in the interest of the 5-year forward view, perhaps in regulation we have a need to think about greater integration.
We've got a couple more questions. I think Bill.
Yes, thanks. My question, I think, is addressed more to Gillian and Victoria. I think last year CQC went through a process of looking at its own values. Is that right? And you came up with excellence, care, integrity, and teamwork, EXCITE, which is a splendid acronym. And behind each of those is a whole set of descriptors. And I think the original idea was that there would be a resonance between CQC's own values, as they self-identified them, and the kind of values that then guided your inspection process. I wondered if that work had played at all in the work that you've been doing on quality and outcomes, cost benefits, or whether it's somehow separate from that.
I think it's been operating quite separately to date. I think that those values very much do play into the way that we are introducing our new regulatory approach then. Kieran described very large teams, inevitably teamwork has to play an incredibly important part in the way that we inspect services. Caring is one of the 5 domains which we inspect against, so it's not just something that we need to do as regulators, but it's also something that we assess providers on. I think we have to have integrity in our judgments. I think that the values really do play through into how we inspect and how we regulate. And I think that we're on a journey of developing our organisational values and how we operate as an organisation, and how we translate that into how we work with organisations. And I think that that's a journey that we'll continue to develop as we go.
Did you have anything else?
No, I wouldn't. I think
Thank you. One question here.
Thank you. The question could be to anyone on the panel. I think it was kind of jumped to mind with the pharmacy presentation, because that's the world I come from. But certainly in Ontario too, the pressure on regulators to put more into the public domain, to be more transparent about what we're doing. Public reporting is really important. And kudos to try and do the outcomes on the right things and the emphasis on the right syllables, because I think for too long we've been, certainly in our world, looking at things that really we used to think were important with respect to operational stuff. But when you really look at, does it matter from, does it really impact, or how are all these things, whether you have 16 or 12 graduated cylinders or beakers or all of those things we used to put a lot of emphasis on, how does that impact, safety and quality and competent care? And so I think that that's one thing. And I was hoping that maybe this whole thing about public reporting might help all of us, no matter what sector we're in, try to put the right things, the emphasis on the right things, knowing that it has to be out there, knowing that the public needs to have it in the right context so that they can make good decisions, and that we're not putting out something that's giving them information that isn't allowing them to do that.
I agree entirely that it's really important that reports are published, and that's something we intend to do once we've got legal powers to do it. There are issues though around the length of time between inspections, because you can publish information for the public, but it can then become out of date fairly quickly. And so we have to consider issues like that to ensure that the information that we have got out there is actually current and reflects the position at the time.
Yeah, but I think you're right that reporting should the process of reporting should put people's attention in the right place. One of the things that we've discovered in unpacking the logic model is even in the absence of being able to publish the report, the business of producing a report actually becomes a learning experience for the pharmacy and helps to focus their attention on the outcomes and the standards, and particularly those that really matter to the public. So we don't need to think about the additional benefits that are derived across the population through publication, and that's something which we are coming to thinking about in terms of how ratings are designed and how reports are published.
Just running out of time. Do you want to make a quick comment?
Very quick question from me. Will, perhaps to Gillian and Victoria, will we eventually know the costs? So you've talked a lot about the benefits, and you've said at the moment we can't tell you the costs, but will we eventually, from this study, know the costs as well?
So that's the intention is to be transparent about CQC's costs and benefits, and part of that is establishing exactly what the costs are of its regulation. At the moment, there's a fairly good picture on what CQC's own costs are. We break that down into sectors and into CQC's different regulatory activities. As I mentioned, we also need to understand what the costs are to other stakeholders, so to providers, to other regulators, to people who use services, if they're going to be involved in inspections, that also puts some costs on them as well. There's very limited evidence at the moment, and the idea is that case studies will allow CQC to build up an evidence base on those costs over time, and that would then be part of the information that's out there on CQC's costs and benefits as part of that assessment.
I'm very happy interviews. We're developing into a fascinating conversation, but in the interest of having a warm lunch, I have to move this on, but thank you very much for all of the panel.